So one of the largest questions I got from the last videos that we did was when we sort of touched on, could Instagram have beaten Facebook in a what if world if they had just remained independent? I think they had just raised 50 million, 60 million bucks. Growth was unstoppable. Zuckerberg made a great move. How do you think about Instagram had they remained independent? What could they have done?
Sure. So I actually think Facebook would have been in deep trouble had Instagram remained independent. And I think it was obvious way before that financing round was happening. So I gave a speech, I think I alluded to very senior executives at Visa and banking leaders in January or early 2012. And the first slide of the speech was Instagram versus Facebook, and Instagram's going to win. Nobody in the audience had heard of Instagram, which was a little bit awkward. But in any event, the reason why is at the end of the day, Facebook is still a photo sharing site. They don't like to talk about it this way, but if you actually if you actually work with anybody at Facebook and figure out and ask them for access to the metrics around what do people actually do with the product, it's around photo sharing. So if you debundle photo sharing and you reinvent it for mobile and you start to thrive, you actually threaten the core of what Facebook is. Now, Facebook has added a messaging layer that's very successful as well. Facebook Messenger, both as part, an integrated whole of the Facebook experience as well as a separate app, is doing very well. So it's added messaging as a component to the core Facebook experience. But at the end of the day, if it's not photo sharing, and if you're not monopolizing photo sharing, you're not dominating photo sharing, Facebook has a real fundamental problem. And Instagram was getting to the scale where you could see it becoming the default way to share photos on a mobile device. Fortunately for Facebook, Instagram was willing to sell, and for a fairly reasonable price. Now, Instagram only had 13 employees, no revenue. So to turn that business into a very real business, there was a lot of work to do. Managing 13 people is very different than managing 150 people or 1,000 people. Generating revenue is very different than running just a popular service, iterating on features that have value proposition to users that they love. So there was a lot of work, and it would have been very easy for Instagram to make an execution mistake, but the long-term macro trends were clearly all on Instagram's side. And so it was a very wise, extremely brilliant move by Facebook to buy Instagram and basically take off the direct competitive threat and postpone that for a long period of time.
Now let's take that a step further, because now in hindsight, obviously that number that they paid for Instagram looks like a steal. And lately,
I wouldn't argue it's a steal. So I'd push back on that again, because Instagram, although it could have been more successful and probably should have been more successful than Facebook, there was so much work to do. So much work in terms of building a team of 13 people into a real company, building a company that generates no revenue into one that has a scalable revenue unit that has profits, that competes in the world. So Twitter's done a great job, for example, of creating a native ad unit that is differentiated, has certain performance attributes so that people are buying it. There's a set of customers that love it. And Instagram would have had to go through all that learning experience, which would have been 3 to 5 years, and then get all of those right. If you make a misfire on your hiring, your culture decays, there's a lot of challenges there. So I think the price was very fair for both Facebook and Instagram. I don't think Instagram would redo that transaction per se.
Okay, fair enough. So let's talk about a company now that Facebook and Google had been looking at, Snapchat, which may be going down that 3 to 5 year path of turning the product into the business. So they've also unbundled the photo sharing element. We've tweeted a lot about this, right? Never touches a web. Really interesting gimmick inside the app. Do you see them as potentially having a chance to be the standalone multi-billion-dollar company entity?
I think they definitely have a chance of being a standalone multi-billion-dollar company, and I think there's a lot of real work to do, though. Continuing to grow, of course, and continuing to build out your team, complementing the core, DNA of the original team, figuring out how to build a scalable revenue model while not suppressing the usage and demand and attractiveness to the end user, scaling that, differentiating that value proposition, proving that it has an ROI to the advertisers or directly to the users if that's the model where users are buying things directly. So all of that's a lot of hard work, and it's easy to make a mistake. So I was involved in a company that was actually kind of comparable to Snapchat back in the day, called Slide. We built slideshows originally on MySpace, hence the name. It was very successful. We had up to 150 million uniques per month. Couldn't figure out the exact formula how to monetize that way in a scalable way. Now, we were built on top of the social networks. which were sometimes hostile to us monetizing because they were selling to the same movie studios that we were pitching. Whereas at least Snapchat's built on a generally neutral platforms of iOS and Android who are not directly competing. So they have a better shot of building an advertising model. But that stuff's very, very difficult. And at some point you get value not just on your users and your user growth, but on your ability to convert that into economic value. And that's a big transformation. So sometimes selling at the right price is incredibly attractive compared to if you had to reinvent that company as an operating business, you would actually take 5 steps backwards before you'd be able to go forward in terms of valuation.
Got it. And so the final question on this is, obviously the price tag around the implied price tag around the WhatsApp deal, has everyone stopping for a minute and asking, do you think that will, in the short term, affect early stage mobile valuations?
I don't think so at all. I think like WhatsApp is a big outlier. As you've written about, it's an extreme outlier on many dimensions, but the valuation itself is an outlier. It had so much scale. There's a nice chart that O'Malley published about the level of scale and how rare that is. Not many mobile apps are ever going to get to that scale. B, the difficulty of getting to any scale on mobile it hasn't gotten any easier. If anything, it's arguably getting more difficult. So the early stage valuations are still reflecting the difficulty of getting escape velocity, critical mass, density. And so that's what we look at when an entrepreneur pitches us is what's the opportunity and how big could it be? How ambitious could this be if it works? But what's the path, the short-term path to actually get to your first 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, 10 million users? And that's extremely rare and difficult in mobile. And it's always been rare and difficult, generally speaking, for a startup, but it may be worse and more difficult on mobile. So early stage valuations where you're taking a risk-adjusted bet and assessing the probabilities of success definitely haven't changed just because the one that made it all the way through is super valuable. That's always been the case. The one exceptional person that can do the only thing, if you're the only one in the world who could do what you do, you're going to have extreme value, but that doesn't affect the probabilities that there's another one of you coming.